welcome everybody today to this 3 NIHR Research Skills Mental Health Programme seminar. Today we have Rhiannon Barker, who was one of our first award holders, I would say, from year 1. Rhiannon is going to be talking about engaging marginalised young people in research, looking at the intersection of mental health, school exclusion and gangs. And just to mention that we will be recording the presentation and uploading it onto our website after the event. So without further ado, over to you, Rhiannon.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks so much for organising this and giving me the opportunity to share some of this work. My plan, I think, is to try and just talk for about half an hour or something and have questions at the end. But given there aren't many people, I'm very happy to, if any of you have queries as we go along, then please do just raise your hand. But so yes, these slides are just intended to give a taste of the NIHR supported fellowship I completed last year. And if there are particular kind of aspects that you'd like more details on, because I'm going to skim the surface, then please do let me know at the end. So let me get going. The outline of the session. So I'll introduce myself, just give an overview of my research questions, talk about what the problem is, why did I want to do this particular area of research. I'm going to talk about my public engagement work and how I try to increase diversity of the sample and to really engage young people. Then look at my research outputs, dissemination. I'm going to show a little clip of a video that was produced by some people with school exclusion and the criminal justice system. And then I'm just going to talk about kind of how I think this work could be used, the practical applications of the work and the challenges of being able to do that. So yeah, first of all, a little bit about me. I'm now an assistant professor at the London School of Hygiene, a social scientist. By background, I've worked kind of across the statutory and voluntary sector, but only quite recently in academia. So I've worked more on the kind of front line in the NHS. I favour realist methods of inquiry, which kind of acknowledge the complexity of the environment in which we all work. I've had quite a lot of experience in different ways working with marginalised and vulnerable groups. I did a PhD, which was a realist inquiry looking at national policy for end-of-life care. And I have a particular interest in ethics, particularly kind of prompted by this work that I'm describing now, diversity and inclusion. And I should probably say to start with, kind of in the interest of reflexivity and positionality, that I had a son who was involved in gangs, which is why I got involved in this area. I thought it was particularly important to look at the young person's point of view in relation to this area of work. So a quick overview of the research. What were my research questions? There were 3 questions that I set out to try and answer. Firstly, how do young people describe their transition into gang-related activity? And to what extent are school experiences, particularly school exclusion and mental health, implicated in this? So looking at the intersectionality of those 3 things. How do young people describe their experiences of the interventions that they've been in touch with, both kind of statutory and voluntary charitable sector? And how are these implicated in their accounts of their transition then into gang-related activities? I should say I'm using the term gangs here, which is a very contested, it's a very contested term, and I use the definition of gangs from the Euro Gang survey, where it includes involvement in criminal activities. But in my actual research, I only use the terms gangs if young people said that they were involved in gangs. And the third question was, what do professionals working to protect young people against involvement in criminal gangs see as the factors influencing whether or not they become involved? So I was looking at both professional and young people perspectives, although I privileged the young people's perspectives in my write-ups. So what's the public health concern? There are lots of systemic intersectional overlaps between a variety of risk factors. So vulnerable children or those with mental health are at much higher risk of school exclusion. And that's shown very clearly in the literature. And both exclusion and mental health are patterned by gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic inequalities. So all those factors are implicated. Boys are much more likely to be at school excluded than girls. Boys are much more likely to kind of externalize their anxieties and their anger, whereas girls are more likely to be more, to take it more inside, kind of deal with it internally. Black Caribbean pupils are 1.7 times more likely than white British counterparts to be excluded. So there are real differences in race. White working class kids are also much more likely to be excluded. And there's a growing evidence growing evidence to show that kids who are school excluded are much more likely to become involved in criminal activity. So all these factors kind of intersect and overlap. So how did I do the research? It was divided into two phases. The first phase really was kind of patient and public involvement and scoping the work. I did a literature review. I consulted with a range of different stakeholders, both policy, education, academic. I set up an advisory group, again, with people from across those range of stakeholders. And importantly, I worked with stakeholders, particularly with adults who themselves had been school excluded or engaged in the criminal justice system, and I got them to help me develop the methods that I then used in the qualitative work. So I piloted creative methods of research with them. And then the second phase of work was participative research with young people. So I managed to interview in the end 29 young people within a range of settings, including statutory through local authorities. I actually interviewed a number of people within the youth offending service and in other kind of local authority settings. I worked with schools. I worked very closely in Liverpool with a school for young people with social and emotional issues. And voluntary agencies, yeah. So this phase of work privileges the collection of data from the perspective of young people, and it was a mix. It was mainly interviews, but I also did kind of observational and participative work as well. It was a real challenge to access young people, as you can imagine. So young people seem to be at risk of gang membership. Are highly mistrustful, obviously, of people in authority, and they tend to either remove themselves from school or they've been school excluded, and they don't tend to access so readily kind of community networks. So they're also they're not only mistrustful, but they're also very hard to actually access. Yeah. And there's a big fear of reprisal. There's a big thing about, you'd never snitch on anyone else. And so, there's definite concern that as an interviewer, I might then have to go and report them to services. So there's all sorts of ethical issues and concerns to consider. But for me, providing a channel for the voice of these young people who really are seldom heard is really important. So it seems well worth the difficulties of finding creative ways and ethical ways to reach them. Access is both restricted by gatekeepers and it can be facilitated by gatekeepers. And there are a number of reasons why gatekeepers don't like researchers, particularly accessing the young people they're involved with. There are issues about being overburdened. You know, they have more than enough stuff on their hands without people kind of, you know, wanting to do interviews, and they often don't really understand the value. And indeed, sometimes there isn't a value. So there's a real justification, I think, in challenging us as researchers to demonstrate what the outcomes are going to be. GDPR compliance is top of mind, particularly with local authorities. That there are concerns about having their service judged. They feel as researchers maybe that they're just opening a whole can of worms, about the type of things that might be uncovered. Value of research, concerns about efficacy of the study, and worries about safety, worries about, you know, is it a good thing for young people to share feelings which are often very, very difficult feelings, deeply emotional stories of kind of violence and abuse, and how safe is it to do that? So they're all very valid, I think, the concerns, and all of them need to be properly addressed. And the way to do that, or part of the way to do that, is really to work hard at establishing trusting relationships and being as open as you can about what you think are going to be the benefits and what are the potential pitfalls that needed to be kind of safeguarded against. So young people in this research have a history of being failed, excluded, overlooked in their relationships and interactions with system support, and are therefore, as I said before, often very mistrustful of anyone in authority, including researchers. The majority of the people I accessed in the end, the 29, I think 20 of them had been school excluded. The vast majority had been involved in the criminal justice system. And the vast majority had suffered mental health challenges, although only about half, I think, had been officially diagnosed. Most of them felt that they did have mental health challenges which had never been properly recognised or addressed. Relationships with people in authority are often tricky, although there were many positive exemplars. So you know, there were some who definitely did have strong relationships. That there was a lot of stuff that had also gone wrong, and a lot of times they'd been let down. The systems have very high thresholds, as we all know, for offering support. So these people were really at a very high level of vulnerability and need. And yet once in the system, the gatekeepers are keen to kind of keep them there, to boundary them. So the gatekeepers themselves can be quite mistrustful of other people wanting to kind of come in and look at the way things are done. So how did I build diversity and representation? The challenges that I've just kind of looked at, and the barriers confronted in doing the field work were significant, and it means that a lot of people, I think, are reluctant to carry out this kind of primary research on these hard to reach groups. And so that in the end they end up interviewing just older age groups, or they use parents as a proxy, which isn't always ideal. And actually in my research, the mean age was 16. So I was quite pleased that I did manage to kind of keep to the younger age groups. But I had to be prepared to kind of go down a lot of dead ends in order to access these people. So of the 55 organisations I contacted in the end, 3 local authorities helped with recruiting. Sorry, that it was a mix of local authorities and charities and voluntary organisations, but most were dead ends. You need to really take the time to build the trust and to convey a proper understanding of what you're trying to do. And you need to be creative about different approaches, different tolerances to risk, different ways of doing things. I worked really closely with the ethics committee. Initially, the ethics committee insisted that I needed parental consent, but I argued quite strongly that there's been a lot of research that shows that if you require parental consent, it can really bias the type of sample who you manage to access, because a lot of my young people had been kind of disenfranchised, didn't particularly live with, weren't close to family members. And so in the end, it was agreed that gatekeepers would also be in a position to give ethical approval. I mean, of course, the young people gave their consent as well. So I was very open and reflective about my own personal context, and that helped often with kind of getting access to these young people. And I was observant of the kind of or cognizant of the power dynamics going on, and some of my methods that I used really try to address that kind of evening of the power between me as a researcher and the research participants I worked with. So, for example, I went around with kind of paints and pens. I got them to doodle, to draw timelines. I asked them at the beginning of the research of each interview to draw. I asked them to draw a picture of me, and I drew a picture of them. And it sounded kind of scary and frightening, but actually it was a kind of funny process. I can't draw at all well, and most people did it, and most people kind of laughed along with me. So that worked well. But you need to lean into creative methods. So the outputs from the work, I did a number of blogs, webinars, conferences. I've done 4 first authored papers, one on ethics, one looking at methods, one looking at kind of school related findings to do with school policy, and one looking at links to gangs. In my initial proposal, I didn't think enough, I don't think, about how to involve young people in creating the outputs. And I kind of subsequently, I tried to compile kind of anonymous narratives of some of the stories I've told and turn them into audio podcasts. And I also got a video, which I'm going to show you a little bit of, which was produced by a group of young people who had experience of criminal justice system and school exclusion. And I'm not very clear. I mean, I would love to be able to use those kind of outputs in things like PSHE classes, and there have been some local authorities interested in trying to develop those things with me. But it's a kind of whole project in its own right, which needs additional funding. And but it kind of speaks to me about the challenges of this kind of research, because it seems to me so important that those outputs should move on seamlessly from the research. But unless you kind of account for them and budget and get funding at the word go, and you involve your partners, it's actually very difficult to do. So I would love that to try and kind of discuss that a little bit more at the end of this presentation. I'm going to try and show you next a clip of this video, which was made by a group called Reality Art, a group based in London. I didn't really get involved in the video other than kind of brief them at the beginning about what I wanted, and brief them about the research kind of findings that I wanted included in it. But they then went off and did their own kind of work, and they actually did a few interviews with some of their contacts, one of which was a young person still in prison. And it's all well, I'll show you the video and then we can talk more about it. It begins just silently for the first minute, and I'm going to stop it after 5 minutes. So yeah, I hope it works.
How did you get here? Really and truly, it all started in school. If I tell you about how teachers dealt with my behaviour, you wouldn't believe it. My ADHD wasn't taken into consideration. Most of the time this resulted in exclusion, which I believe wasn't the answer. Looking back, I realised I needed more of a person-centred approach. You know, an approach where they deal with my issues specifically, because I had the willingness to learn. However, my energy was just too much for me to sit down all the time. It just doesn't match my learning style.
Hearing you speak about your school experience leaves me a bit gobsmacked. Over the years, you have definitely grown and you speak much better. I completely understand some of the issues you've brought up. However, put yourself in my shoes. I was following school rules and a government curriculum. I had no capacity to give you undivided attention while teaching a whole class.
I understand this, but this has now led to further stuff in my life, such as offending and lack of opportunities. School days, I could have achieved higher grades if the teaching style adapted more to my learning style. Looking back, this is just how I feel.
Should we have a look back at your school experience?
Yes, it will give me a much better understanding.
Great. Let's begin. Do you remember the day when I asked the class to write down their ideas after just doing a group activity? Then you finished yours early and began to disrupt the class. What next step did you expect me to take?
I remember that. That day you clearly gave me 0 chances.
Because I have been teaching you for a few years. I know once I give you more than one chance in a classroom, you do not stop. So I sent you to your support teacher. I felt like he could have given you better help on the sociology topic.
Okay, so you thought about me there. Find it rather hard to believe. Let's look at another scenario.
There was a time when I was introducing a new topic, so it took a lot of time for me to speak on it, and I had to showcase a few videos. I knew it would be long, and your attention span is very short, so I allowed you to get up and walk around the class if you needed, and to stand by the window. And towards the end of the explanation, you started throwing papers at other students. What do you have to say about that?
Firstly, thank you. Thank you for thinking about me and allowing me to do things to control my ADHD. However, you could have started some group discussions at some point. You could have asked for some of our opinions at some point. And what we've learnt so far, I wasn't the only one with a lot of energy in the class. I was just the one with the worst. I was the most active. You could have done more active stuff in between. Do you understand me? Now, look at these things. It just has a domino effect on me. I couldn't choose classes I wanted to in my GCSEs, such as food tech, drama and sports, which led to me falling out of my head teacher and after a major argument.
Anything more you'd like to add?
Yes, I would like to add that all these issues led to exclusion after exclusion, fights after fights. As you can see from the school football game, I was very aggressive and angry, but it was all for the right reasons. The school should have noticed this and helped me channel my energy and anger into something productive. I could have been great at football. This could have changed the course of my life. They used my interest and my strengths against me rather than giving me a platform to develop. They took the opportunity away from me and used it as punishment. I expressed my interest in fitness and sports, but when it came to applying for work experience, my school stuck me in a construction role that I had no interest in whatsoever. I ended up not going, so then I got an absent referral, and then I didn't pass my grade. Then I get into more trouble. Can you see how this is going here? Just one domino effect after a domino effect. The first group of people I could call my friends or my circle were the kids in the exclusion room. The kids that got kicked out of class, the kids that the school had absolutely nothing to do with. This is the first family, my first community, and we were just all influencing each other. Once the school excluded me, I am now just out in the community with other socially excluded kids. Due to my parents being at work till 5 p.m. Once this starts to happen, you build a bond with a group, and it just feels like a family, which I didn't really have at home. Then we get into antisocial behaviour. Then I protect my friends by any means, and then the rest is just history. To the Met, you are a gang, but to me, it's just a group of friends.
Let me hear more.
Now there's just one big cycle of fighting cases and offending. I'll take accountability for what I've done, but there's a lack of opportunities. So I'm trying hard to change in a society which won't allow me to rehabilitate once there's something on my DBS. Imagine the outcome if I had gone to a different school, if I was supported and nurtured correctly, even though it was the same government curriculum.
stop there because she then interviews another kid and tells another story. But yes, that's just an example of one of the outputs which has tried to be a little more kind of focused towards the young person's perspective. So this is my final slide before I'd like to open up the discussion, which kind of tries to summarize some of the main issues that I found. That schools face, growing pressure from multiple directions, including a very strong academic focus still. There are very high parental expectations, and this is all in the light of declining student mental health, insufficient resource, and a big burden from regulators from Ofsted. And yet their capacity to provide a protective framework where children can kind of flourish and grow and learn, not just in academic ways, is absolutely imperative to building a kind of more equal society, particularly for children, for more vulnerable, marginalised children. So it's a very big challenge that is faced, and yet rates of school suspension and school exclusion continue to rise. There was a dip, obviously, during the pandemic, but they're back on the increase now. In the autumn term, for example, of 23-24, there were 279 suspensions from English school, it's been showed that people who find it particularly hard to engage are people who find it harder to access that very academic curriculum. So it seems to me that there's a challenge to find ways to influence the school curriculum. That's partly what I would like this piece of research to be doing. There's so much evidence now that shows that young people suffer increased mental health challenges if they're not able to access curriculums, if they're more likely to be engaged. And yet, educational policy and practice seems to move very slowly to address that gap. There's a lot of kind of ad hoc projects we're doing, where there's really good pockets of work. And yet, changing that broader policy is a really difficult thing to do. And so I suppose I would love to ask you, and I know you come from a range of different backgrounds, how we as researchers can contribute productively and effectively, to doing that. And I feel my outputs from this research have been kind of quite wide and quite broad. And yet I know it's a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean of change. And I guess the more, quiet voices you have, the louder the noise can become. But anyway, I would love to explore that with you. So I think I'm going to stop there. And yeah, I would love to hear your kind of comments, questions. I'm very happy to go into more detail on particular research findings if that's of interest. But yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rhiannon.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah. The video was so powerful. I could have sat and watched all of it, to be honest. Yeah, it was great. I don't know if anybody's got any comments or questions for Rhiannon at all. Anything you'd like further detail on? I'll kick off then. One thing I was going to ask. How collectively do you tie the findings from this work with policy and practice? And it's quite a big, difficult question, but...
I mean, one of the things I tried to do was when I set up my advisory group, I included people from Department of Education, Department of Health, people who I knew were involved in and interested in policy in this area. And that was good, and they have been really helpful along the way. Those kind of civil servants actually shift positions quite frequently, and so maintaining that kind of continuity in connections is difficult to do. and maybe it's partly expectations. I think maybe my expectations were kind of too big initially, and that's an important thing to consider. You know, what can I, as a researcher, having done this bit of work, how can I hope to impact on it? And publishing papers is always a really funny thing, because it's so hard to get papers published in peer-reviewed journals, and there's a kind of sense of relief and triumph when they're finally published, but then there's a kind of deafening silence, and you think, well, what's happened to that? What's the point of that? And how do I move it all on, you know, faster and more effectively? I think it is a real conundrum, and I know NIHR and 3 schools do, you know, really try to address that themselves, but yeah, I think it's an ongoing challenge.
I'm guessing it's really difficult making sure that, you know, this research and the results are getting to the right audiences as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else has got any questions at all. Oh, there we go. We've got one from Nirundeep. Is that correct?
Hi, it is Nirundeep, but you can call me Nirun. That's absolutely fine. Nice to meet you. I'm based at UCL at the moment doing a PhD, but I'm also part of a wider research consortium called CALO, which has been doing some broad work looking at kind of some of the population level determinants of young people's mental health, and also trying to take quite a co-design and participatory approach working with young people. I've been involved with some of the work that we've done with young people in Newham, and a lot of the themes that came up through that, although we weren't focusing initially on challenges around gangs and mental health specifically, certainly that did come up within some of our work. So, and a lot of the things complement some of your findings, Rhiannon. So I guess in terms of your question about how do we you know, create work together, it does feel like there's something about how are we in a position to be able to pull together, not just from the one study that we've done, but like the number of bits of work that have gone on across the country that have found similar things, and be able to pull them together and bring them to the attention of people as they're potentially changing policy around education, particularly, which feels like it might be a bit of a right moment round about now. One thing I was reflecting on when you were talking, particularly when you started out talking about your study and your PPI, and then you had that reflection point where you said you hadn't thought enough about bringing young people's voice in, and I think there is another one of the tensions we face with kind of publishing peer-reviewed journals is we want to produce these like very transferable findings, which then lose some of the story. And it's quite interesting when you handed over those transferable findings to some young people to create an output. They've created an output which I think is very effective in terms of creating a story, which I think is very powerful when you're talking to policymakers. And actually, I've got to, I confess, I didn't really see what was on the writing on the blackboard in that video, but what I heard very, very strongly was that very powerful story that we hear of the young person's experience.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I said to them, I'm not sure about the writing on the blackboard. And they wanted it there, I think, maybe to kind of authenticate what they were saying. It seemed really important to them. So I just thought, well, fine,
But so in some ways, it's kind of almost like, I know you didn't set out to do it deliberately, but it's almost like a nice roundabout way to have gone through kind of like a rigorous research process, I suppose. But yet also have that really strong narrative that this is kind of what a young person's experience kind of at the front of it. Even though you didn't set out to do it that way, it's kind of, I don't know. I think it's quite interesting that that's how it's turned out. Because that's certainly something I guess I guess one of the reflections I have is I'd quite like to share. I don't know whether that video is available to share and forward on, but I can think of a lot of voluntary and community sector organisations who I think might find that quite an interesting way to articulate a lot of what some of what they try and articulate in their day-to-day work but struggle to do so. And I guess so I guess sort of sharing that sort of output more widely.
Yeah. Well, I think I'd be very happy to share it with you. Claire has been trying to persuade NIHR to put it on their website, but there have been certain stumbling blocks there. Actually, I mean, the other output that I'm really excited by, and I think they're so good and immediate, are these little, very short audio podcasts that have been narrated by young people who were involved in the research, but they're like they're kind of, I don't know what you call them, they're stories, but they're from a lots of different stories woven into one, so that they're anonymous. And my idea was to present, there's audio from someone.
Oh, it might be me actually.
Oh, is it? Oh. My idea was that they could be used as a part of a module, as part of a PSHE module, and you would have a number of kind of questions to ask the class about, I don't know, reasons for entry into criminality, or, the complexity of some people's lives, or just considering the brutal environments that some young people grow up in and discussing them, I think would be a really important part of PSHE, and it certainly fits with some of their kind of aspirations in their curriculum. But again, just kind of getting, the resource to create that kind of properly it's a difficult thing to do when you're, scrabbling around trying to apply for other things as well. But I think you're right, sharing these things is important. And actually, I'm working on a systematic review of qualitative literature at the moment on serious youth violence, very much from a young person's perspective. So I've managed to sneak one of my papers into that systematic review. So that's, things do eventually get disseminated, don't they, in a variety of different ways. But that's really interesting to hear about your work, though. Thanks so much, Rhiannon, for sharing that.
And I can promise you, Rhiannon, all is not lost with getting things out there. We have commissioned a company to write an impact document for us, basically, on some of our awards, and yours has been selected.
Great, thank you so much. That's great news, Claire.
I promise you.
Thank you.
If I can just come in again, sorry. One other thing was that, I mean, I think one key opportunity or moment is when the government do consultations or calls out. They have them in various different names, but what calls for evidence, often they do. And I'm not sure that academics often kind of receive them or get them. The main reason I'm familiar with them is because I've previously worked in the GLA, and we tend to be a bit more tuned into them then. But I did, when I first came to UCL, there was one out, actually, I think it was a regional one rather than a national one, around violence among women and girls, and we quickly got something in there, and that, I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily due to our submission, but there was some funding of some kind of services that came out of that. But I guess it's just that one, if you have that network of academics from different institutions who've worked on different projects who are able to quickly come together and submit something, because they usually have quite a short turnaround window, just like a few weeks, and we don't normally work to those kind of timescales. But that would potentially be another way of sort of something to be on the lookout for, and being able to pounce on. And I'm just not sure that we're that good at doing that as academics.
No.
But I mean, I'd certainly be happy to be sort of part of a network that keeps an eye out on that kind of thing in this field, to be ready to pull something together.
So frustrated by it, because it seems to me so straightforward that there are so many areas that are really difficult to work in, and I know education is absolutely overloaded with so much stuff, but there's a lot of talk now about beginning to change curriculums, and given that hasn't really changed for so long, it's kind of maintained this academic focus. And when you look now at the mental health stats and you see the links, you just think it just makes so much sense that we should at least have more kind of what's the word, statutory, social and emotional learning, because that will support everyone, but particularly the more marginalised kids, to have more kind of practice about, I don't know, developing conversational skills. And sorry, what were you about to say?
Well, no, I was just about to say, the other thing I thought about was, I don't know if you've ever heard of the podcast The Rest is Money.
Yeah.
But there's sorry, the co-presenter on there this is a topic she cares quite a lot about, and I almost wonder whether getting in touch with her with some of your work.
Right. That's a nice idea. No, thank you. It's
out there. But
tangential
she's quite
things.
hot on this.
Right.
She's quite hot on this, and yeah, okay. I just think she might be really interested in kind of like the link to education, specifically, because that's really her bugbear, and the academic system, and how it doesn't serve the majority of young people. So she could be, I mean, I'd do that. I can send you her name. I do have it.
Yeah.
But,
that would be great. Thank you so much.
I'll do that.
A good connection made there.
Well, no, I don't know her personally, but I just think she might be receptive to the work.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know if there was any other final points before we have to go. A few folks are putting in the chat that they need to leave, so I think that's probably all for today. So thank you once again, Rhiannon. It's been fascinating. I've always said since day one, this is the project which I'm most interested in. So,
Claire, thanks so much for facilitating it all. You've been great and really useful, and lovely to talk to you, Naren, as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.